All right. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to our last chat of the year for our leadership chat series at the Journal of Science Policy and Governance. Thank you for joining us today. In addition, thank you to STEMPeers for sponsoring this series. My name is Nicole Parker, and I'm JSPG's Director of U.S. Outreach. And today, this session will be co-moderated with JSPG's CEO and Managing Publisher, Adriana Bankston. For those new to JSPG, JSPG is an open access, peer-reviewed publication dedicated to elevating students, postdocs, policy fellows, and young scholars in science, technology, and innovation policy and governance debate worldwide. Over the last several months, we've had several of these chats with these leaders at JSPG. And if you missed them, please take the time to check them out. Our previous chats are on our YouTube page. At this session, we welcome Senior Program Officer at the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, Lida Beninson. Lida also has the pleasure of serving on the JSP Governing Board and previously served as an editor at JSPG earlier in her career. Lida, welcome.
Thank you.
So Lida, some of our followers may know you as a member of the JSPG Governing Board, but can you get us started and explain a little bit of how you entered into your role in science policy?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think a common thread to many folks who are in the field of science policy is they started on the traditional research path in graduate school. And so that story is no different for myself. After I finished my undergrad degree, I did go and work in the quote unquote real world, only to discover that I was really passionate about science, and I decided to go into research, not really quite understanding what was involved there, but thinking that it sounded like a pretty cool career. And so I went into graduate school, into a PhD program, and there I was studying integrative physiology. And I absolutely did love learning. I really enjoyed doing the research. But as I was taking a look around at many of the faculty that were in my department, I realized that doing the grant rat race and the pressure that came with it was not what I wanted with my life. And I couldn't quite figure out what other options I was going to have career-wise if I had a PhD in my field. And so I kind of hit a crossroads right between like my master's and my PhD about what to do. And I happened to discover just through a newsletter from my college, which I usually just delete before even reading it, that we had a research program in science and technology policy. And that was actually the first time I'd ever even heard of that concept, but it intrigued me. So I applied to the program, which was also a graduate program, but a certificate program. And I took the intro science policy class, and all of a sudden it was like I found my calling. It was one of the courses where I just couldn't stop being engaged, probably over participating in a lot of ways. And I realized, at least sort of scholastically, academically, I liked the topic, but I wasn't sure I was ready to make the jump into science policy. So I actually worked with my PhD advisor so that I could get a sort of a release in the summer to do an internship in Washington, D.C. to see if I actually like science policy in person. And I was very fortunate to have done an internship at the National Science Foundation. And in my 8 weeks in that internship, I realized this really was the fit for me. But then the question was, do I finish my PhD? And as I was talking to a lot of folks in Washington, D.C. who were doing cool things in science policy, the consensus was, look, knowledge-wise, you don't need what comes with a PhD. But to have a seat at the table for the credentials, it really, really, really helps to have the PhD. And so for me, I said, okay, well, I'm on that path already. So I'll complete the PhD, but I will always keep a hand in science policy because I don't want to lose this connection that I've made now with the science policy world as I go through and complete my PhD. So I continued my coursework in science policy, but that's also when I discovered the Journal of Science Policy and Governance. And I volunteered to be an editor right from the get-go, their very, very first issue. And that was one of the many ways that I tried to stay involved in science policy as I finished my graduate career.
Wow, that's amazing to just be involved when the very first issue came out. It's really a pleasure to hear about your journey and to find out that you found out you want to do science policy very early in the game compared to a lot of people that we know are interested in venturing into the area. And so we know that you're now at the National Academy. So can you just tell us a little bit about what the National Academies does?
It would be a pleasure. I absolutely love the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, but I did not know about them until I came out for that internship during my graduate time. And what we are is an independent organization. We are not a government agency. And we were established by Congress and signed into existence in 1863 by President Abraham Lincoln. So we are a pretty old institution for the United States. And the mission from the very beginning was to provide independent advice to the nation on issues around science and technology. And of course, in the 1860s, that would have been in agriculture and it would have been in warfare related to the Civil War at the time. But since the 1860s, science and technology has pervaded almost every facet of our life across the world. And so as a result, the portfolio and the national priority issues that the National Academies addresses is extremely broad. So, we've grown past warfare and agriculture and botany, and we're looking at things such as climate change, we're looking at transportation, we're looking at all aspects of health, medicine, and engineering. And it's been extremely exciting because we still adhere to our mission that was set back in the 1860s. And the way that we do our work is we convene some of the top experts around the world, and we bring them together in a voluntary capacity to help them come to consensus about how to address national priority issues. And so that's amazing, right? You're taking some of the world's top people and they are serving as volunteers to provide their expertise and recommendations on how to address critical issues, not only for the nation, but for the globe. And the fact that we've been able to do this since the 1860s and grow has been really amazing. And so what I do at the National Academies is I help to direct a lot of those studies, and I collaborate with those experts, and I work with my colleagues at the academies to help develop the evidence, bring it together, and bring the committee to consensus to develop recommendations. It's very, very rewarding.
And now I'm going to toss it to Adriana to ask a few questions as well. Adriana?
Yeah, thank you, Lida. So that's really interesting to hear. I would love to hear more about some of the reports and workshops that you've led during your time there, and with the lens of, in JSPG and in this chat, really want to highlight perspectives on the next generation and their views in science policy. So I'm curious how also the insights of early career researchers have been helpful in developing some of these reports.
Yeah, absolutely, Adriana. So just to answer your first question, my portfolio of projects that I have directed at the National Academies has been very, very broad. They've included topics in the biomedical sciences, in defense testing, in aviation safety, in sustainability education, in intercollegiate athletics. And personally, it's almost like I have a dissertation every 1.5 to 2 years. So maybe that's the aspect of a PhD that's really helped me in my current job. But I think some of the more relevant topics or the more relevant reports that I've done for this sort of episode actually start with my very first study that I was commissioned to do at the National Academies. And that was on the biomedical and behavioral scientific workforce. And this was actually mandated by Congress. It had bipartisan support from the Senate. So that means that, it was mandated in Congress that the National Academies had to do this study. And the issue that we were trying to solve at the time was we are creating an abundance of talented scientists in the biomedical and behavioral sciences. However, we are overproducing them in the sense that there are more PhD scientists who could qualify to apply for NIH grants, for instance, than there are grants for them. And we were seeing this impact on the data where the average age where an early career researcher obtained their first major NIH grant, which was known as the R01 grant, was your mid-40s. And it was starting to become an alarming statistic because I think a lot of folks who did go into the biomedical research fields getting a PhD were not equipped with the knowledge that it might be until their mid-40s when they might be able to actually establish research independence. And this was thought of as a critical issue in the for the nation because, what are we doing with all this talent? And indeed, I was one of those folks who was pursuing this biomedical degree and realizing that I didn't want to be a part of that sort of career span. And so the study that we did there was sort of figuring out, well, how can we create corrections in the system? What is available? And it's pretty tricky because you don't want to tell people, well, don't follow your passion of biomedical research if that's what your passion is. But instead, the committee took the idea that one, at least provide the data so that potential graduate students have information before they go into these careers. And very few higher education institutions actually provide career data on where their PhD graduates or master's graduates even go. And if you look at that data, you'll realize that usually less than 20% of those students actually end up in a research position at an academic institution, which we found is exactly what they are all trained to do. And so we're training all of these really talented students to go into a field where they're just not going to get hired. The majority of them are not going to get hired, and they're not being provided necessarily professional development opportunities to apply what they're learning in their graduate programs to some other career. And so we really dug into the data and the incentive systems there. And there was a realization, that the onus doesn't rest necessarily on the early career researchers themselves, but there needed to be some guardrails in place at the NIH level, at the higher education level, and even at the faculty level. Like, how could NIH shape its grant packages to say, you've got to provide professional development opportunities for everyone who gets mentored or who participates in research on this grant. And what does that look like? Does professional development just look like an online tutorial that you take, or should there be some structure around it? And is mentorship an important part of that? And if so, how and why? And how do you support it? And how do you quantify that support? And what kind of penalties can the NIH institute if faculty aren't providing these opportunities, or the higher education institution aren't providing these opportunities? So that was one of the first ways that we really started, that in a project where I got to participate, that we really tried to explore how to help early career researchers. And then I was very fortunate to work with a lot of other colleagues who were exploring reforms to graduate education, as well as undergraduate education in STEM fields. And I'm always happy to take more specific questions on that if you want follow up there.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I like your points about, I do think we need more career data and really guiding the next generation to where they might be able to go, or how to use their science in society or different careers, whether it's academic or other things. And I know that some of their views have been taken into account in these reports. So I think maybe a broader question then is, how do you think the next generation can make an impact on the research enterprise as these reforms that you are discussing, but also to make sure that they are advancing their own future?
So that's a great question. And it's tricky because on the one hand, if you look at the broad STEM enterprise, how much onus do you want to put on the students and early career researchers themselves as opposed to making systemic change from the top down, but what needs to come up from what can be driven by the students and the early career researchers themselves. And so, some of the things that we were running across, I can't necessarily advocate for them, but I can at least tell you what we've seen. Certainly are, groups where, let's say, postdoctoral researchers can sort of create or sort of join postdoctoral research groups that are working to sort of articulate to higher education institutions and the research agencies in the government, kind of like a list of, not necessarily demands, but things that should be required as part of the early career researcher experience. And so we know that there are a few postdoctoral organizations that do that. There's also been discussion about unionization of graduate students or postdocs. Of course, I know it's a loaded topic, and I know that there have been some groups in California who've been doing that. And I think it's worthwhile to keep track of what has been happening around those unionization efforts, what's working well, what's gaining traction, where are they running into barriers, are they able to clearly articulate what they are looking for their own early career researchers. But on the flip side, there are opportunities where early career researchers could participate in issues around science policy and in professional development. What's not known to a lot of folks is that almost all the National Academies meetings have open sessions by law. If we receive information from anybody outside the committee, it has to be publicly open. And that's actually a really great opportunity for early career researchers to engage on these sorts of topics, or at least share their input, maybe on a different project or a different domain, but providing an input from an early career researcher. And so the National Academies has, like, right on their front page an events button, and that just sort of tells you all sorts of publicly open events that are available to participate in. And post-pandemic, hopefully people will be able to do that in person, because we don't just have them in Washington, D.C. We have our meetings across the country. And as I said before, they have to be open by law. And so I do encourage early career researchers who are interested in a variety of areas, whether it's professional development or just better contributing to their own research domain, that they take a look at the National Academy's website to see where they might be able to engage in a meaningful way.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you for the answer. So it's great to know what these opportunities are, and we'll make sure to share the open sessions with our authors as well, which I think would be really helpful.
Absolutely.
Great. So I'll turn it back to Nicole now.
Thanks, Adriana. So a few of the reports that you happened to mention just now are very focused on advancing STEM education and workforce needs, particularly in the graduate education and postdoctoral research area. And so, as you probably know, JSPG has recently launched a call to papers on STEM education and workforce development, and it has a submission deadline of January 23rd. And so, with your expertise and some of your work in this space, just wondering, what are some challenges and barriers that you've seen to actually changing the current STEM and education and workforce system that we have now? And if you have any insight, are there ways that early career researchers can be more involved in pushing forward the changes that they would like to see?
Yeah, so maybe working backwards in your question, looking at some of those postdoctoral and early career research organizations are certainly worthwhile for a lot of folks. Additionally, some of the scientific societies that are associated with your research area may have kind of an early career researchers branch or a focus on professional development opportunities. But then kind of moving backward in your question, Nicole, about reforms to graduate education, for instance, there are a lot of areas for consideration. I think the main one that we have observed in our work at the National Academies is that there are just some long-standing institutional barriers to change. University research system has taken a long time to become established, and there are many, many people who would argue that the United States research ecosystem is one of the best in the world. obviously that is a self-serving comment. But because of that, it's hard to point out why change needs to happen. And I think the change that is articulated the most often is we need to stop trying to create carbon copies of the PIs, the principal investigators. Graduate education is not about trying to create more of yourself. Graduate education should have a lot more clarity from the viewpoint of the institution and the program about, what it's meant to provide to the students. And it does not have to be uniform across institutions, but that clarity needs to be clear. And there's one of the things that's definitely an impetus to change is just even at the faculty level. Faculty are not necessarily incentivized to do anything other than bring in a lot of grants and write a lot of papers and put them in high impact journals and continue that cycle over and over again. And sometimes they're even rewarded for producing more and more PhD graduates in their laboratory. And that doesn't seem like an incentive system that makes sense anymore. Does it really actually serve the students themselves? Does it even actually serve that scientific discipline or domain? And so, there has been a lot of efforts to sort of figure out, how do you change the incentive systems? Is this something that comes from the research agencies, where the research agencies have to demand from the faculty, okay, we're going to give you this grant money, but as a result, you need to produce something other than a carbon copy of yourself. You need to have, formalized mentorship. You need to have, offer a list of how you are culturally sensitive. Are you providing resources for professional development? But in actuality, that's very difficult to keep track of. It's very hard to know that the PIs are doing a good job. And to be frank, not all PIs are trained to be great mentors. The PIs themselves don't necessarily know about other professional development opportunities or other careers outside their own field. So it's a very complex issue. And the participation of early career researchers and PhD students and master's students in those conversations is really important. And it needs to happen at a campus level, right? From the graduate student organizations themselves. It needs to happen with interfacing with, the larger research administration at institutions, as well as interfacing in some way, shape, or form with the government agencies, which of course is the hardest way for early career researchers to have an influence. And that may be where, joining some of these organizations can be helpful, like such as, actually, I can't remember all the postdoc organizations at the top of my head at the moment, but sort of joining those sorts of organizations and having a clear voice about the change that they would like to see.
Yeah, and that's really helpful, because a lot of those organizations, like you said, do have people who it's their job, right, to try to influence what these agencies are doing in respect to their careers and their training. So thank you for your answer there. And so earlier you alluded to serving as an editor on the very first issue for JSPG. So I'm going to turn it over to Adriana to have a deeper conversation about your experience while you were here.
Yes, thanks, Nicole. So that's amazing. I didn't know that either. And clearly, JSPG, I think, has been a part of your career for a long time. It sounds like, from the beginning to being one of our editors-in-chief, and now being on the governing board, which hopefully has been a good experience. And we really appreciate all your service as well. So can you talk a little bit about how you view the journal as part of your own career development in science policy?
Oh, absolutely. Before I came to the journal, my only experience with writing, other than, for courses, was in technical writing. I knew how to, I was being trained to write journal articles, scientific journal articles. And that is absolutely not the kind of writing you do in science policy at all. And one of the reasons why I volunteered to be an editor for JSPG is I wanted to push myself to start learning how to write and communicate outside of that very technical scientific training that I had received. And in addition to that, I knew that if I moved into science policy, I would have to broaden my sort of my scientific knowledge. I needed to get outside the biomedical field, and I wanted to learn about other areas that were important in science policy. Issues related to making sure you have the right radioactive components for MRIs, making sure that there's adequate climate change mitigation in India. I just wanted to learn how to become exposed to those areas, how to communicate about that and learn about it, and also have the opportunity to start communicating with some of these fantastic authors that were submitting articles to the journal. I'm not a great networker. It's never been my thing, but this was a really great way for me professionally to engage with scholars outside my field and learn from them and learn how to communicate with one another in an effective way. And so the journal was incredibly key for me, sort of broadening my communication skills as well as broadening my knowledge of science policy issues globally. And the chain reaction of that experience as an editor and eventually editor-in-chief is that I think it helped me strengthen my application for when I applied to be a science and technology policy fellow here in BC, because I was able to demonstrate, science policy specific communication skills, and also a dedicated interest in the field and this ability to think outside of the research domain that I had been trained in. So I think that was a really big part of sort of the move that I ended up making to where I am now. But I've just been amazed to see how the journal has grown so much. It's got international contributions, it's creating these wonderful partnerships, and I think it's really creating wonderful opportunities for early career scientists to think about the work that they're interested in a much more global and public way. And I couldn't be more thrilled to have been a part of it from the beginning.
Thank you. That's really nice to hear. And that's definitely something, looking back now, we've been around for 10 years, and it's really amazing to look back at everything we've published and the breadth of topics and the number of folks who have helped sort of transition, because for a lot of them, the journal really has been the first time that they've been exposed to policy. And so it's really nice to hear your story and how you've used this experience to transition and to where you are today. So I'm going to ask sort of the flip side of this question then. From your perspective as governing board member, and if you have the next generation of graduate students who are listening in today interested in careers in science policy, of course seeing your trajectory, how do you think they can take advantage of the journal to advance their own professional development?
Yeah, absolutely. I can't express how great it is to be involved with the journal. One, being a contributor, I think is huge, because the way that the journal interacts with authors is so different than traditional scientific journals, right? It is actually a very collaborative experience where the editor and the author or authors actually work together to really strengthen the article. Oftentimes it might be the scholar's first time contributing to a paper that's not necessarily exactly in their research domain. And so it's such a fantastic exercise to be able to not only submit, because you have to think about your work in a different way, but it's also just a great experience to work with the editors in that collaborative fashion. On the flip side, volunteering to be an editor is also a really great idea too, because, as I said before, I think I enormously benefited from that experience. I wasn't a great writer. I still don't think I'm a great writer, but at least I know how to write for science policy. And it was really effective in making me just think differently. I had to get myself out of my PhD training brain, right? And I had to start thinking instead of going and targeting lower and lower and lower in my research, now I had to think broader and broader and broader. And that was such a valuable experience that I had as an editor. And I think that, either way is a really great way for folks to engage with the journal. And I think either way is really beneficial as well. And I've even heard of times where, departments really encouraged all the students in the department to sort of submit to the journal and to think about that as they were developing, whether it was a paper for their coursework or something like that, so that it could have far-reaching implications, not just in audience, but also in authorship experience as well. So I hope that answers your question. And if I missed anything, please let me know.
Yes, thank you for that answer. So it's really nice to hear the editorial perspective, and I'll take this opportunity to let people know that we will have applications open for the editorial board in January. And we just held an open house this week to have a few of our editors talk and have prospective editors ask questions. So just keep an eye out for that. And again, Lida's experience, I think, is a testimony to how this can be helpful to your careers as well. So thank you for that. And then I'll just turn it back to Nicole to ask a few more questions.
And so we're right up against the half hour, so we're getting ready to close it out. But before we do you have any additional thoughts that you would like to leave us with today before we sign off?
I think that maybe a thought that's a little bit controversial is I live in Washington, D.C. I work for an independent organization. I am I actually don't watch the news. I don't get swept up in everything related to the news. And it's pretty funny because I work on all these issues that do show up in the news. And if I talk to folks about them, they all have opinions that were all sort of fed by whatever news source they read. And I've realized, for me personally, it's been very important to stay kind of at arm's length away from kind of common stream media around topic areas that I am working on, because I'm human and they warp my thinking, and I need as much as possible to maintain an independent viewpoint on the projects that I work on. And that is really tricky. I can say though, by not looking at the news, I think it's been tremendously helpful for my mental health as well as for me career-wise. So maybe that wasn't the advice I was supposed to give, but that's a little nugget of something that I wish more people knew about here in DC.
No, I think that's extremely, extremely helpful. And as someone who also works very closely in science policy, I agree to try to keep that separate because it can take a toll on your mental health, especially when there's a lot going on. So thank you, Lida, for providing that nugget. I think it'll be very helpful to our listeners. And so with that, thank you, Lida, for really all of your responses. They all were extremely great. And I know that our listeners have learned a lot about the national academies and also about how they can get involved with science policy at whatever career stage that they're at, and how they can get involved more so with the journal to kind of elevate their experience in science policy. So thank you for providing that insight. And so to our listeners, we really hope you enjoyed this fireside chat. Please be on the lookout for our upcoming events that will happen in the new year. And we want to just thank you all for attending and have a happy holidays. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.